Starting now, the effects of exercise on the muscle in an aerobic exercise where I have endurance exercise. It's like running a marathon. Remember, the main source of energy in this case is going to be the cellular respiration, in which I would be breaking down the glucose in the presence of oxygen to generate ATP, and as a byproduct, I would be releasing carbon dioxide and water. So the main things that the muscles here are going to be focusing on is having more oxygen available. And in order for me to get more oxygen, I will need more blood to be delivered to my muscles. So the muscle is going to be building up more capillaries, more blood vessels, getting into my skeletal muscle. I will need mitochondria. This is where the energy production is going to be taking place. I will need more stores of oxygen within the muscle. So I would be building up more myoglobin within the skeletal muscle, as this is going to be the storage form of oxygen within my skeletal muscle. As a result of training, performing aerobic exercises, the muscle will have greater endurance. It's going to be more fatigue resistant, and this will increase the strength of the muscle. In resistance exercise, typically it's an anaerobic exercise where I will be performing a high intensity workout. I am focusing more on the strength of the muscle rather than supplying the muscle with oxygen. So the muscle will be hypertrophied. I will have enlargement in the size of the muscle fibers. I will have also increases the number of mitochondria to supply more energy. Myofilaments gonna be increasing, the glycogen stores gonna be increased, and I will have accumulation of connective tissue within my skeletal muscles. All this is gonna result in an increase in the size of the muscle. But the problem here is that those larger muscles don't have fatigue resistance as what I do have in those muscles that have been performing aerobic exercise. So if you have a runner and a bodybuilder who's gonna get larger, who's gonna be having larger size of the leg muscles, a bodybuilder or a runner who has larger muscle size, a bodybuilder or a runner. Bodybuilder gonna have larger muscle size, but who can run for longer duration? The runner can run for longer. He has fatigue resistance. He has better endurance. Again, why? Because as he kept training, he is performing aerobic exercise, and his muscles did build up lots of capillaries. He has better supply of oxygen to his muscles, so he is going to be performing aerobic respiration rather than anaerobic glycolysis. If I told you I will start training my biceps today using this pencil. So I'm starting to train my biceps. I keep contracting the biceps holding this pencil. So would there be any increase in the size of the muscle if you see me 2 years from now? Not much, right? Not much. Why? Because you understand the overload principle. So overload principle is so simple. You need to be forcing the muscles to work hard in order to promote an increase in the muscle strength and endurance. I need to force the muscle to work harder for me to have any gains. Because if you didn't work hard enough, the muscles will have no reason to adapt to the increased demands. So, in order for us to have gains in the muscle size, in the endurance of the muscle, we need to force the muscles to work hard in order for them to adapt to this increase in demand. Moving on to our second type of muscle tissues that we are looking at in this chapter, which are going to be the smooth muscles. Smooth muscles, as you remember, they are going to be located in the wall of the hollow organs, all hollow organs except for the heart, which contains cardiac muscle tissue. The general rule of the arrangement of the smooth muscles in the wall of those hollow organs is that those smooth muscles are arranged into two layers, a longitudinal layer and a circular layer. Usually the circular layer, in most of the cases, is going to be the one on the inside. It's deeper. Compared to the longitudinal muscle layer, it's usually on the outside. It's going to be external. So you have an inner circular, outer longitudinal muscle layer. This is going to be the case for the smooth muscles. If you remember, smooth muscles didn't have this striated appearance. They are spindle-shaped muscle cells. Each muscle cell has a single nucleus. They were mononucleated. The major difference between the skeletal muscle and the smooth muscles is the arrangement of the filaments. If you see on here, this is how the filaments are arranged. Unlike the skeletal muscles, they did have those thick and thin filaments that are alternating with one another. The filaments here are going to be arranged in a diagonal way, diagonal. Other major differences between smooth muscles and skeletal muscles, the calcium here is not going to be binding to troponin like in the skeletal muscles, but it binds to another protein subunit called the calmodulin to activate the contraction rather than binding to the troponin in the skeletal muscles. If you remember back in the skeletal muscles, the neurotransmitters that we're using to allow the contraction of skeletal muscles is the acetylcholine. Compared to the smooth muscles, I have two different neurotransmitters that will enhance the contractions. Those are the acetylcholine and the norepinephrine. So you've got two neurotransmitters rather than one. Hormones and stretch will be greatly affecting the smooth muscles contraction. If you remember, during labor, we've seen a hormone that enhances the uterine contractions. Back in chapter 1, this was the oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone released from the posterior pituitary gland. It enhances the uterine contractions, and the uterus is formed of smooth muscles. So you've seen, other than waiting for a signal from the nervous system, the smooth muscles also going to be responding to hormones and stretch, like the stomach, for example. Whenever I have an increase in the degree of stretch in the wall of the stomach responds by increasing its contractions. Because I know that whenever I have an increase in the degree of stretch in the wall of the stomach, this means I have food inside. And if I have food inside, I need to break it down, I need to digest it. So this stretch will enhance the contraction of the muscle. So stretch and hormones are going to be ultimate causes of smooth muscle contraction. The contraction of smooth muscles can be maintained for longer periods of time compared to skeletal muscles. So for how long can you train your biceps? An hour maybe, or less. But for how long can you keep eating? You can eat all day long. So the muscles of your stomach can contract for longer duration compared to your biceps, as an example. So smooth muscles can contract for a longer duration compared to skeletal muscles. First in class activity for today, question here says, which is not a factor that enhances the force of contraction? Recruitment. Remember what is recruitment? It's the number of muscle fibers that you get activated. Does the number of muscle fibers that you get activated will be playing any role in the force of contraction? Yes, the more muscle fibers that I recruit, stronger contraction I will get. Frequency of stimulation. If you remember, the higher the frequency of stimulation, the less time you allow to relax, and the stronger the contractions will be. The size of the muscle fiber, remember, the larger the size of the muscle fibers that you activate, the stronger the contractions that you're going to be performing. So which one is not a factor? Actually, all of those are factors that enhance the contraction of the muscle. All right, so the good answer here for this question is going to be D. We have two types. We have two types of smooth muscles. We have a single unit smooth muscle and a multi-unit smooth muscle. Single unit smooth muscles, this is a visceral muscle that acts the same way like the cardiac muscles, like the heart. In the heart, I don't have a graded contraction. I have an all or none contraction. What this means? In order for me to perform an effective contraction to pump the blood out from my ventricles of the heart, all the muscle cells in the wall of the heart need to get the same signal all in the same time for them to contract as one unit. And why do you need to contract them all as one unit? In order to create an effective muscle contraction to pump this blood out from your ventricle. I need to contract all the muscles in the same time. So it's an all or none contraction. Whether I contract all the muscles or I relax all the muscles. This is the same concept as a single unit smooth muscles. Single unit smooth muscles are sheets that will be performing arrhythmic contractions. And what allows those to contract in a rhythmic manner in order to allow the movement of food, for example, along the gastrointestinal tract, is that the signal reaching one of them is going to be traveling freely to the rest of them. So here I have gap junctions between those smooth muscles, allowing them to act as one unit, as a single unit. They don't rely on external stimuli to initiate their contractions. They exhibit spontaneous stimulation. So the stomach itself creates its own electrical impulse, the same like the heart. The heart has its own pacemaker. So if I disconnected the heart from all the nerve fibers connected to it, the heart will still be contracting. The same concept for the stomach. If I cut all the nerve fibers coming to the stomach will still be contracting. It generates its own action potential or electrical impulses that enhances its contraction. The muscles are arranged in opposing sheaths that will exhibit a stress relaxation response. So in order to allow the propulsion of food along the intestines, for example, I would have parts that exhibit stress and other parts that will exhibit relaxation. So for the food here to move from the parts with high stress, high tension, to the parts with lower tension, allowing it to move forward along the gastrointestinal tract, which we call the peristaltic movement. Exactly, peristalsis. The other type of smooth muscles, it's going to be the multi-unit smooth muscle. And multi-unit smooth muscles are going to be located in your airways, in the lower arteries, erector pili muscles, the iris of the eye. And here, it's not all or none. I have different grades of contraction. So if you're looking at the pupil of the eye, what is the function here? It's to regulate the amount of light that is traveling to the inside of your eye. So you don't want to have an all or none contraction. You don't want to have either all the muscles have contracted, so the pupil of the eye is fully constricted, or all of the muscle fibers are fully relaxed, so the pupil of the eye is completely dilated. You don't want neither of those. All right. You want to be able to regulate the amount of contraction according to the amount of light that you get exposed to. So you don't need an all or none contraction. You need a graded contraction to determine how big is the pupil going to be. All right. And accordingly, you're going to be able to regulate the amount of light traveling into your eye. I exhibit here a graded contractions in response to the neural stimuli. Moving on to homeostatic imbalances that are related to the skeletal muscles. We're looking here at the Duchene muscle dystrophy, and this is the most common and severe type of genetically inherited skeletal muscle homeostatic imbalance. It's a sex-linked disease. It's carried by females and expressed in males. It's representing 1/3500. It's due to the lack of dystrophin that anchors the thin filaments to the z-discs. The problem here with the Duchenne muscle dystrophy is that victims will become clumsy and will fall frequently. I would have major progressive weakening of the skeletal muscles. Usually, patients die by in their 20s due to respiratory failure. So I start to have progressive weakening of the skeletal muscles, which gets worse over time. Worse, it's worsening, and this weakening of the muscle will reach the respiratory muscles to the extent where I'm not able to breathe. No cure is available for this disease, but viral gene therapy and infusions of stem cells with corrected dystrophin genes are still under trial. So they are trying to insert the good gene in the cells in order for the cells to form the dystrophin, which is the protein that anchors the thin filaments to the z-discs. Myocenia gravis, it's an autoimmune disease in which the immune system starts to produce immunoglobulins that will attack the acetylcholine receptors on the muscle side. So imagine on here, my immune system starts to compete with the acetylcholine. So those are my immunoglobulins. They start to bind to the acetylcholine receptors. So if I got a signal down from the brain stimulating the nerve ends to release the acetylcholine, what's going to happen? The acetylcholine won't find the receptor for it to bind to, for it to create an effect on the muscle cell. As the immune system is producing immunoglobulins that will be competing against the acetylcholine. Symptoms include the muscle weakness, drooping of the eyelids, difficulty in swallowing and talking. And those are two highly characteristic symptoms of neuromuscular disorders, because swallowing and talking are highly complex tasks that we do perform. They require fast responses by the muscles. In order for you to swallow, you need to contract, relax in a very rhythmic manner. Same for speaking. Speaking, you are sending out signals to a large number of muscles for them to contract and relax in very specific patterns in order to create the sounds that will form your speech. Questions? Questions? All right, so we're going to have a brief introduction of the anatomy of the muscles. We're starting here, chapter 10. And if you remember, chapter 10 is going to be the muscles anatomy, and this is going to be the upcoming lab in which we are studying the skeletal muscles. All right, so again, this is chapter 10. You have those PowerPoints on Canvas. Those are called the APIL here. Muscles, APIL 9 and APIL 10, muscles part 1 and part 2. Those are the PowerPoint presentations in which you can find the muscles. Again, you're gonna find the underlined muscles. Those are the ones that we need to know. Also, you're gonna have the list of the muscles along with all the information that you need to know for those muscles required for the exam. Let me pull up here the Canvas page. All right, so under module 3, what you will find chapter 10, the muscular system. This doesn't have much of the muscles. It has just the topics that are not directly tested on the muscles lab exam. The parts that will be tested on the lab exam are the parts under the APIL 9 and APIL 10, muscles part 1 and part 2. You're going to have also the muscles list for AP1 lab. This is a PDF file, like the ones that you've received for the bones. You're going to find the different muscles that you need to know to be able to identify, and the action of each of them, attachment of each of them. So only the information stated on the list, this is what is required from you to know for this upcoming lab exam. The same like the bones. The bones, you were required to know the bones on the list as well as any information related to those bones from the list. Same concept on here for the muscles. I'm not expecting you to know all the attachment of the muscles. I'm not expecting you to know all the actions of the muscles, but I'm expecting you to know everything stated on this list. All right, whether it's an attachment, it's an action, everything related to the muscles in those 3 pages, it's going to be tested on the upcoming lab exam. So this is here again, you can find this under module 3 called Muscles List AP1 Lab PDF. And you're going to find a muscles lab practice exam as well. So after you study the muscles, like what you did with the bones, we did have this final review, you're going to have a exam like practice exercise where you're going to be practicing to get an idea about how the questions and how the test looks like. All right. Any questions on where can we find the material to prepare for the upcoming muscles lab exam? Any questions? Again, all under module 3. You're going to have those 2 PowerPoints that we're going to be discussing starting on today, APIL 9, APIL 10, and you're going to have the muscles lab practice exam. This is the practice exercise that you have to test yourself before taking the actual exam. And you have the muscles list on here. This is the required information that you need to know for the test. This is the required information that you need to know for the exam. All right, so starting first with important terms. If you remember, what is a muscle contraction? What is a muscle contraction? Muscle contraction is a shortening in the length of the muscle. This is the simplest way to think of it. Shortening of the length of the muscle. Something that we need to know is that any muscle has to be attached at least to 2 points. At least to 2 points. 1 point, one side of the muscle, it's going to be what we call the origin of the muscle. A second point of attachment is what we call the insertion. So again, the points of attachment of a muscle is going to be the origin of the muscle and the insertion of the muscle. When you shorten the length between the 2 points, what's going to happen? What are your choices? Either to move the insertion towards the origin, or you move the origin towards the insertion, or on very limited basis, you're going to be pulling both points toward each other. And this is going to be the muscle action. So very important, very important. In order for you to understand the muscle action, you need to know what are the 2 points of attachment of the muscle? What are the 2 points of attachment? Because if you know the 2 points of attachment and you know where is the muscle, what joint am I passing in front or behind or next to, you would be able to figure out the action of the muscle. You don't have to memorize it. You can just figure it out by knowing this basic information. So you know where is the origin from, where is the insertion from, and where am I traveling, so I can guess or interpret the action of the muscle. So as a very simple example on here, if I'm looking at the scapula like this, this is my coracoid process, this is my chromium, this is a glenoid cavity, this is the head of the humerus, greater tubercle, and this is the shaft of the humerus, and capitulum and trochlea on here. Radius, the lateral bone of the forearm, and the ulna is the medial bone of the forearm. So we're looking here at a muscle that gets its origin from 2 points, the coracoid process, and from the glenoid cavity. So it has a head that travels like this, and another head that travels down like this. We call those are the long head and short head of the biceps brachii. So the biceps is going down to be inserted in this point. Because this is my radial tuberosity. So this is the point of insertion. Those are the points of origin of the muscle. So the biceps will be performing what actions? If you're just looking at this diagram, knowing that muscle contraction means shortening in the length of the muscle, knowing that the muscle contraction is the shortening in the length of the muscle. So what do you expect this muscle to be performing as an action? I don't want to just to remember something that we've mentioned earlier. I want you to interpret from the figure what action would it be performed. So it's passing in front or behind which joints? What joints am I related to as the biceps? Knowing that it gets its origin from the scapula and it's inserted in the radius. So what joints am I related to? I'm passing in front of the shoulder joint and I'm passing in front of the elbow joint, right? Those are the 2 joints I am passing in front. So if I'm shortening the length of the muscles, this means what? This means I would be moving 1 point towards the other, and the scapula doesn't move much, so who's going to be moving? It's going to be the radius. So the radius is going to be pulled towards my scapula. As I pull the radius towards the scapula, what's going to happen at the elbow joint? What is this movement that will be taking place in the forearm? Very important. If you didn't study the joint movements, nothing of what we're going to be discussing in this chapter will make any sense for you. So it's very important to study the joint movement. You know, what is flexion, what is extension, abduction, adduction, rotational movement. You need to be aware of the joint movements before you start studying the muscles. So the type of joint is a hinge joint, but what action, what movement do I perform? What movement is it? When I pull the radius in this specific direction, it's a flexion of the elbow. And passing in front of the shoulder joint, I'm also aiding in the flexion of the shoulder. So I'm performing both flexion of the elbow and flexion of the shoulder. Flexion of the shoulder, flexion of the elbow. This is again my biceps brachii. All right, this is simply speaking, what is a muscle contraction and how can it perform its action? Knowing this, a muscle might be performing the major part of a specific action. So we call this as the prime mover. So for example, if I'm talking about flexion of the forearm, the biceps brachii for me is a prime mover. It's the muscle that exerts the main part of the force allowing flexion to take place. This is the prime mover. This is the one that exerts most of the effort, allowing this movement to take place. If I told you you're going to have another muscle lying underneath the biceps, it's called the brachii or brachialis muscle. And it's also passing in front of the elbow joint, aiding the flexion, but it's not exerting the main force that drives the flexion of the forearm. So it's an aid to the prime mover or the agonist. So who's the prime mover in terms of flexion of the forearm? It's my biceps brachii. The brachialis muscle is, in this case, is going to be considered a synergist. What I mean by a synergist, it's a muscle that aids the agonist to perform its action. It adds force to the agonist. We call this as a synergist. What if I told you in the back of the arm, I have a muscle. This is my head of the humerus from a lateral view. And this is the capitulum, trochlea, radius, and ulna. All right. If I told you in the back of the humerus, we've got a muscle with 3 heads that would be traveling posteriorly to be inserted in the olecranon process of the ulna. This is called my triceps brachii. Triceps brachii, it's going to be pulling on the olecranon process. So as it pulls on the olecranon process, what action am I performing? I'm performing extension of the forearm. I'm performing extension of the forearm. So this means what for me? Means I will be opposing the biceps. So if I'm talking about flexion of the forearm, what is the prime mover or the agonist for forearm flexion? It's going to be my biceps brachii. It is the prime mover, the main muscle that exerts the force to drive this action. What is the antagonist muscle in this case? What is the antagonist muscle in this case? The one that opposes the action of my biceps. It's going to be my muscle that performs the opposing action, which is my triceps brachii. So again, if we're looking here, we're looking at a muscle might be an agonist. It's the prime mover. It's the muscle that exerts the main part of the force that drives a specific action. This is what we call an agonist. And if we're talking about flexion of the forearm, the prime mover is going to be biceps. An antagonist is a muscle that will be opposing the action of the prime mover. It performs the opposing action. Like the triceps here, if we're talking about the flexion of the forearm. A muscle that aids the prime mover to perform its action is going to be a synergist muscle. Synergist muscle. What if I'm not willing to move the insertion, but I'm willing to move the origin of the muscle? So if we're looking here, this is the back of the skull. This is my external occipital protuberance. Those are my mastoid processes. This is external occipital crest. This is the back of the skull on here. Occipital bone and the temporal bone. And down here is going to be my atlas. And those are going to be the vertebrae of my cervical spine, cervical region of the cervical spine. And this is the neck here. And forming the shoulder. Participating in the formation of the shoulder joint of the shoulder. Remember, we've got the scapula like this. This is the spine of the scapula, acromion, and this will be the glenoid cavity where the head of the humerus is going to be articulating. So again, what we're looking at in here, it's the back of a person. As we're going to be studying in the next session, we're going to learn about a muscle that takes its origin from the external occipital protuberance, external occipital crest, and from the spinous processes of the cervical and the thoracic vertebrae. So all this is the origin of the muscle. And it will be inserted in the spine of the scapula here. So the fibers are moving down like this and up like this. We call this is my trapezius muscle, so also from the superior mucous. Trapezius. So what is the origin again? The origin is head, spine. And the insertion is going to be the spine of the scapula. Spine of the scapula. So what action can I perform if I contracted the upper muscle fibers? If I contracted those muscle fibers on here, I would be pulling the scapula up. I would have elevation of the shoulder. If I contracted those middle muscle fibers, I would have retraction of the scapula. And lower muscle fibers gonna allow me to rotate the scapula, rotation of the scapula. All right, so this is if I contracted the muscle while the origin is fixed. What if I don't want to move the scapula? So the scapula is going to be fixed in its place. It's not going to be moving. And instead, I will be contracting to pull on the head. So what's going to be the action of the trapezius if I'm fixing the scapula and pulling the head towards my scapula? So what's going to be the action on here? It's going to be extension of my neck. So head or neck extension. I am putting the head backwards. All right. So the trapezius might be performing movement of your shoulder by putting on the scapula in the different directions. But also, if you fix the scapula, you can pull on the head, allowing neck extension. Is this clear? Is this clear? Yes, no? All right, great. So in order for me to pull on the head, not the scapula, I need something to fix the scapula. So you're going to have other muscles that will fix the scapula in its place to allow you to not pull on the scapula, but to pull on the head for you to allow neck extension. So we call those are fixators. So fixators in this example are the muscles that will fix the scapula, preventing the scapula from moving to allow you to pull on the head, to allow you to pull on the external occipital protuberance, crest, and superior mucous lines, to pull the head backward, to allow neck extension. All right. So again, what we're looking at in here is another type of muscles that are not adding force to the agonist. They are not opposing the agonist. They are not the agonist, but they are fixators. They are synergist muscles, but they don't aid or add force to the prime mover. Instead, they immobilize the origin or the insertion to allow you to perform your action. All right, because those are fixators. Fixators. How do we name the muscles? According to what? Many factors that we use to name the muscles. First, according to the direction of the muscle. If the muscle fibers are traveling straight, something straight is recta. So we're gonna call it rectus. So if I have a straight muscle of the abdomen here, straight muscle of the abdomen, what do you think I will call it? It's rectus abdominis. Rectus abdominis. Rectus, straight. If I have in the thigh, straight muscle of the thigh, we're gonna call this is rectus femoris. Rectus means straight. Femoris, it's related to the thigh. All right, so rectus is a straight muscle. Transversus or transverse, if it travels at a right angle. Oblique, if it travels at an oblique angle. Also, the shape of the muscle, if it was circular muscle, it's what we call the orbicularis. Orbicularis means the muscles are forming a circular pattern. So if I have a circular muscle here around the eye. So we're gonna call it orbicularis, like orbit, orbicularis, and it's related to the eye. So we call it oculi, oculus, something related to the eye. So orbicularis oculi. Also, we can see a circular muscle here around the opening of the mouth. Remember, something related to the mouth is oral. So we're gonna call this as my orbicularis oris. Orbicularis means it's circular. This is orbicularis oris. This is gonna be orbicularis oculi. Orbicularis means it's a circular muscle, Also, according to the shape of the muscle, sometimes we name the muscle according to its shape. So, and a major example on here that we're looking at is the muscle that gets its origin from the scapula and the clavicle. For it to be inserted down into my arm, in the mid shaft of the arm. So this is a muscle on here. It gets its origin from the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. It gets its origin also from the spine and the acromial process of the scapula, and it travels all the way down to be inserted in the lateral aspect of the shaft of the humerus. This is the muscle that forms your rounded part of the shoulder. This is called the deltoid. Why did we call it deltoid? It looks like a triangle. See on here? It looks like a triangle. Delta means triangle. So we call this muscle, it's my deltoid. Oid looks like delta triangle. So triangular shaped muscle, it's deltoid muscle. If you remember, it was inserted in the deltoid tuberosity in the shaft of the humerus, if you remember back from the bones. Also, another characteristics that we might be using in order to name the muscles is going to be according to the number of organs or the number of heads. So the head is the point of attachment of the muscle to its organ. All right, so if I have a muscle with two heads or two organs, this is going to be biceps. So if I have a biceps in the arm, what do we call it? It's my biceps brachii. Brachial means related to the arm. If I have another biceps, another muscle with two heads, but in the thigh, so what would I call it? It's my biceps femoris. So biceps means what again? Means it has two organs. If I have a muscle with three organs, it's my triceps. If I have a muscle with four organs, it's going to be my quadriceps, and so on. So number of organs is going to be a factor that we might consider naming the different muscles. Also, the relative muscle size. So if I have a large muscle in the chest region, so I would call it pectoralis major. If I have a smaller one in the in the same region, I will call it pectoralis minor. If I have in the gluteal region, in the buttocks region, a muscle, a large muscle, so I would call it gluteus maximus. I have a smaller one in the same region, so I will call it gluteus minimus. Also, location of the muscle, as we've seen, brachialis, temporalis, femoris, abdominis. So we will be using the location of the muscle also to name the muscle. All right. Also, another factor that we use to name the muscles is going to be the action of the muscle. So I might have flexor, might have a muscle called extensor, I might have a muscle called adductor, and so on. So the action of the muscle is another factor that we might be using in order to name the muscle. So I will give you a name and you tell me what can you understand from the name, just the name. Flexor carpi radialis. What can you understand from the name? Just the name in front of you from your previous knowledge and what we've just mentioned. What do you think is this name telling you? So what action is this muscle is performing? Flexion, right? So I know the action now. Flexor is performing flexion of what? What parts does it move? What carpi means? Carpi, carpal, remember carpal means related to my wrist. So it's performing flexion of the wrist. And what do you mean by radialis? Radialis means what? Radialis, it's related to the radius, and the radius is on the outside or the inside of the forearm. What do you think? It's the outside of the forearm. It's on the outside of the forearm, right? So you see, this is my flexor carpi radialis. It's gonna be inserted down here and it's going away from the midline. It's going towards my thumb. It's going towards the lateral side. That's why we call it radialis. Radialis. So if I'm telling you this muscle on here is going to be pulling your hand, so it performs flexion of the wrist and it's going to be pulling the hand away or towards the midline. If it gets inserted towards the outside, will it be pulling the hand to move in or out? What do you think? If I'm inserted in here towards the thumb. When I pull on the thumb, just put your hand like this. Put your hand like this. Hold your thumb with the other hand and pull on your thumb. Would your hand go towards the midline or away from the midline? What do you think? Put your hand in an anatomical position like this. Hold your thumb. With the other hand, pull on your thumb. You're pulling on the outside, radialis. So pull on your thumb. Would your hand be moving inward or outward? Towards the midline or away from the midline? Towards midline or away from the midline? Hold your thumb, pull on your thumb, your hand is moving away from the midline. So this is another thing that I can understand just from the name, radialis. Radialis means it's going to be inserted on the lateral side, so it's going to be pulling my hand away from the midline. In other words, it allows abduction or adduction. If I'm moving away from the midline, am I performing abduction or adduction? Remember, when you are moving towards the midline, you are adding adduction. If you're moving away from the midline, it's abduction. So here, what action would this be performing? It's going to be aiding in abduction of the hand. So it performs flexion of the wrist, abduction of the hands. This is actually all the information we need to know about this muscle. So please pay attention to the details, pay attention to what the names are telling you. The name of the muscle will tell you a lot of things. In some cases, it's going to be all the things that you need to know about the muscle. If you have adequate understanding of the concepts, you would be able to figure out a lot of information just from the name of the muscle. So let's say a name of another muscle, and you tell me what do you understand just from the name. Extensor carpi, radialis, longus. So I am performing what action here? From the name, what do you understand? What action am I performing? Primary action of this muscle is going to be performing extension of what? Of the wrist joint. Extensor carpi. And am I going towards the thumb or away from the thumb? Am I going lateral or medial? I'm called radialis, and the radius is the bone located outside. So outside, I'm lateral. And what do I mean by longus? Longus means it's long. So why would I call a muscle longus? This means that I have another one which is shorter in length. So we're going to call the other one brevis. So this tells me that I have two muscles called extensor carpi radialis. So in order to differentiate between the two, one of them is going to be called longus, and the other one is going to be called brevis, or shorter. All right, so where do you expect to see this muscle? Is it in the arm? Is it in the forearm? Is it in the thigh? In the anterior aspect of the arm, posterior aspect of the arm, anterior aspect of the forearm, posterior aspect of the forearm? Where is this muscle? So just knowing the name, I would be able to guess where is the muscle. So in order to move the wrist joint, where do you think this muscle will be? In the arm to move the wrist joint, or in the forearm to move the wrist joint? In the forearm. And if I'm trying to pull the hand, to pull on the wrist, for it to be performing extension, I am pulling on the wrist, I'm to extend the wrist. So would I be in the posterior aspect or the anterior aspect of the forearm? What do you think? If you're pulling the hand to perform extension of the wrist, are you going to be located in front of the forearm in the anterior aspect or the posterior aspect? You are going to be in the posterior aspect of the forearm. Yes, posterior aspect of the forearm, exactly. So you see here, just from the name, I was able to say that the action of this muscle is extension of the wrist, and it's radialis, so it's going to be performing an abduction of the hand. And I know where is it located. I know being an extensor, it's going to be on the posterior aspect, and being moving the wrist joint, this means it's going to be in the forearm. So when I look at this diagram, for example, on the exam, and I have one of the choices is extensor carpi radialis longus, would I even think of choosing extensor carpi radialis? Would I even think of it? No. Why? Because you can't see the forearm. I won't even think of choosing this. Something like this. Is there any way I can say any of the marked muscles as extensor carpi radialis? So very important, very important. Saves you a lot of time if you understand what is meant by the name of the muscle. Right? I took this time just to give you an impression about how the muscles are named, because this will facilitate the way you think of and study the muscles. 3 pages of muscles, insertions, actions that you have on the list. So those are just 3 pages worth 100 points. Those might be the most precious 3 pages in our curriculum. All right, so very, very, very important to have to slow down. Don't get overwhelmed with the names. Just slow down, think, and process the names for them to make sense. And when you process the names and you make sense of the names, you would be at ease. So it's going to be so easy for you to figure out the names of muscles. You still need to study the muscles, but it will be much easier if you make sense of the information that you're studying rather than trying to memorize the information. All right, is this clear? Is this clear? Any questions? Any questions? All right, so next class we're gonna be discussing all the skeletal muscles. Very, very important before coming to class is for you to review and study the joint movements. Very important, because next class I will be mentioning the muscle and I will state the action. If you don't understand what is this action, what is the flexion of the forearm, or what is the abduction of the arm, or what is the hip extension, or what is the flexion of the knee, nothing of what we're going to be discussing as action of the muscles next class will make sense to you. So very important during this weekend to focus and study on the muscles, on the joint movements, the possible movements of the joints. Make sure you understand by definition what is the flexion of the knee, what is the extension of the knee, flexion of hip, extension of hip, and so on.